not just the General Manager's Wife. It's a pretty loaded title for a book, but it sums up the lack of recognition women on the land have experienced over the years. In a brutally honest memoir, Sally Warriner lets rip about life on some of Australia's biggest cattle stations and how critical wives are. Landline's Kristy O'Brien caught up with Sally, and it's a yarn with a very special connection for our Northern Territory crew.
That's right, Pip. Some stories come full circle, and Newcastle Water Station is definitely up there, but probably more so for my sidekick and cameraman Jumbuck.
Yeah, look, I went to Newcastle Waters in the early 90s and put together a video for Sally Warriner about life on the station, and from there I spent the next few years on and off flying around in a Beechcraft Baron with Ken Warriner all over the CPC stations in the north. Got to meet some great people, got the taste for the bush life in the north, and here I am still doing it. And we managed to find that old video, dusted it off, and we're going to use some of that in the story, so treat yourself.
Sally Warriner certainly looks the part in the middle of a muster in the Northern Territory in the 1980s. But being a station wife wasn't an obvious fit, and at times she felt a lack of the innate pedigree.
The Born to It girls were always going to be much better horse and cattle people than I was, but I persevered and I loved going out mustering.
She's a self-confessed queen of shuffling hats. A nurse, secretary, mother, hostess, quasi-counsellor, homemaker and now author. She's wrung more out of life than most.
You just can't be a princess. You've got to manage what you've got.
One thing that did set her apart was her nursing qualifications.
We have a lot of accidents, a lot of jackaroos falling off horses and breaking arms and legs and things.
A far cry from earning her stripes in English hospitals as a 20-year-old.
It was a pretty wild time in London. I do not know how I did it. And I didn't sleep, I don't think, for the entire time. And I used to ride a little Vespa with my cape billowing out behind me round the big roundabout at Charing Cross.
Moving home and stepping onto the Kimberley dust would prove love at first sight, but not in the way you'd expect.
Everything about the Kimberley, the light changing in the evenings, the gums, the eucalypts reflecting off the water, the millions and millions of birds, all the wildlife. I think the intense colour, the intense blue sky, the changing colours for the sunrise and the sunset. And I also thought the people were wonderful.
Her other great love was initially, anyway, less instantaneous.
Me and my hippie boyfriend more or less got straight on the road and hitchhiked up to Broome to visit my sister Susan, who'd had 2 sons in my absence. So I wanted to see them before heading back to Canberra and deciding what to do with the rest of my life. And that's when I met the GM. And Ken turned around, saw us walking up the road, and he said, "Oh my God, have a look at what the cat dragged in." And Susan said, "Oh, that's my sister." So it wasn't love at first sight.
The GM, or General Manager as she calls him, wasn't her only suitor though.
I was a single girl in town in those years, very, very highly prized. No single women at all.
But revered cattleman Ken Warriner would ultimately win out.
I mean, you basically follow the man. And so I was in love with him, and I loved the Kimberley, and I loved the life, and made a conscious decision that that's what I wanted, without ever thinking, is this going to be too tough for you? It didn't occur to me.
They managed the iconic Brunette Downs in the 1980s before a business venture came up to jointly purchase and run Newcastle Water Station in the middle of the Northern Territory.
We drove over the grid to Newcastle Waters and saw total desolation, because I hadn't been there. And of course, Ken had looked at the cattle and the fencing and the waters, and I don't know whether he'd even looked at any of the houses on the place. So I had no clue what I was going into. And so there it was, a little tiny fibro off the ground because of the above the floodwater, cement-floored little house. And I can't remember catching my breath and thinking, my goodness.
What followed was a whirlwind few years.
It was really rough times in those days. Obviously changed a whole lot now, and needed to. But in those days there was no air conditioning in the men's quarters. There wasn't any hot water. They often had to cook themselves in the stock camp. They weren't even. A lot of the stock camps didn't even have a kitchen. They weren't even carting a van kitchen. Most of the time, I mean, that went on for about 10 years, I think, out there, and there was just no complaints.
She was thrust into being a mother to not just her own brood of boys and stepsons, but the younger workforce.
And I have to say that we did get an awful lot of very white, pimply, hunch-shouldered, unsure, hesitant, shy young men, and they strode out of there in December or November as different young men, absolutely. And the number of parents who've said that time in the bush made my son. So that's something to be proud of.
Raising her own boys in the bush was also a great joy.
They would go out hunting bush tucker, and they did the dances, they went to some of the ceremonies. Their best friends were all Aboriginal kids, and who they played with came down and swam after school, and they're really appreciative of that. I mean, obviously it was safe, well, safe as it can be, you know, there's snakes and what have you, but, you know, barefoot, come home from school, have a feed, and off you go.
The danger and closeness to death was all too frequent, and some tragedies become firmly embedded in her heart.
In your face a lot. The Aboriginal family that perished out there, that was one of the saddest. There was 7 of them, and that was one of the saddest, of course. And little Clinton Liebelt, little boy, lost on his bike out there. The whole community searched for nearly 3 weeks before they found him. He had perished as well. I also attended bad accidents on the highway. If the nurses in Elliot needed help, I attended quite a few of those. They would just call me and I would go in and offside in the clinic in Elliot. And there were dead people, a lot of bad head injuries. You just never knew how it was going to go. There were lots of alcohol was a problem. There were lots of fights, being hit over the head with a nulla or the jackaroos, and you know, lots of accidents. But again, when you're the only person there and you just have to manage it, there is no one else.
One of her worst memories was hearing a mayday and scouring the station for a plane wreckage with her 2 sons on board.
Sitting in that plane for half an hour waiting to see if my 2 sons had been killed, and the film crew.
They survived that and many other plane crashes. It was on the station she also found a deeper understanding of Indigenous Australia.
You been well?
Oh, normally, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I can't say what can kill me. I've been here too long.
She now calls out the divide in those times as a type of apartheid.
I don't know what the solution is, but it was wrong of me, and it is one of the great regrets of my life. I don't think I could have done anything, but I wish I'd been more aware. What was happening then was wrong. It had to change, and it has changed.
Contrast was a constant in life. Hosting guests would mean coming across all walks of life, but perhaps most memorable was a first visit from media tycoon Kerry Packer. After he'd had a minor heart attack, he came north on a hunting trip.
He had a lot of mates with him. I think they had enough ammo on board to knock out Indonesia, I think. And it was a caribou. They arrived in a caribou and they had 2 Iroquois helicopters. One of them had camouflage paint all over the chopper with a Playboy bunny on the front, and they landed the 2 Iroquois on the front lawn.
The friendship would eventually lead to him purchasing the property in 1983, and that's when life really changed, from installing a new homestead to international jet setting.
My time became really restricted because once we started working for PACCAR, everything changed. The visitors increased, the business was booming, we were expanding, Ken was away a lot, I had kids all over the place. I just didn't have any time for 20 years.
The station was a centre point for a massive portfolio of cattle investments for the PACCAR Group.
But we've got all the latest modcons, we've got a good computer system and 4 phone lines and a fax.
Sally and Ken square bang in the middle of it all.
I like to take an interest in the business, and I like to know what I'm talking about when people ring up and speak to me on the phone. And I also do all the food ordering in the store and keep an eye on the kitchen and just keep an ear to the ground, really.
What prompted the final nail in the coffin on life in the North was a write-up and journalist faux pas, so very indicative of the times.
There wasn't anything he couldn't do. And then on page 4, the 3 lines that I got were, Ken's vivacious and attractive wife, Sally, spends her time in the homestead, managing her children and the garden and entertaining guests. End of story. So I walked back into his office, I put it down and I said, if that gets published, I'm suing for defamation.
It was a put-down that she'd had enough of.
You know, to be just recognised as the wife of is just not right. And it was never right.
She also vowed she'd write her own truth one day.
Geez, I bet there were some nervous people there.
Many. I left Newcastle Waters in 2001 and obviously a terribly traumatic time in my life, leaving and marriage breaking down and they were dark days.
And they immediately drew their guns and they said...
Speaking in Darwin at the Northern Territory Cattlemen's Association Women's Lunch, she thinks the industry has come a long way since those days.
They're all head stockmen or they're managers or they're, have got small businesses and they are all individual women in their own right. 80% of that room was under 40.
And for those unwilling to change, she's also a stern warning.
But all those fat old white men are going to be gone soon and read the book Young Girls and say to your husbands, this is what happens if you don't recognise what a efficient person I am.
So what's your final bit of wisdom for a woman heading out to a station?
I'd say you can do it. You might not think you can do it, but just set your mind to it. There isn't anything that you can't do if you really want to do it, or anything that you can't be. Go for it, girl.